Let me tell you the little puzzle that I ran into in thinking about what to say today. I looked at the title of the conference or the event, Macroeconomic and Monetary Policies in the Mediterranean, Management in a Context of Uncertainty. And two words stopped me, made me think. One is macroeconomic management and the other one, times of uncertainty. And I thought this is what I want to talk about. And then I look at the agenda and I found myself under financial sector and I know nothing about it. The only thing I know about it is that it's actually working okay in Egypt. If you don't trust me, my friend Mr. Labiari will be talking about it afterwards. So what did I want to say then instead, and stick to the broad title of the event, and I probably have a story to tell. I thought I want to talk about macroeconomic management in transition. That's number one. Two, I thought I would want to talk about Egypt because I know about Egypt a little more than I know about other countries. And number three, I got stuck with the government for 8 very long months, and I thought it might not be a bad idea to share with you some of what went on during these 8 months. And let me, before I tell you what I'm going to talk about, let me tell you the bottom line. The bottom line is that Egypt is navigating its political and economic transition reasonably well, despite the fact we have some detours, setbacks, and probably some things that you don't particularly like. To continue the story is that I'm optimistic about the future. I think there are enough very strong reasons and ingredients to make for a brighter future in Egypt. And the combination of Tunisia and Egypt, I think, will provide the other Mediterranean countries reasonable examples to follow. One feels quite saddened by what's going on in Iraq and Syria and Libya, maybe Yemen, but hopefully the goods will overcome the bads, or the bad developments, if you like. So this is the bottom line. How did I want to organize my thoughts? Every time you want to do anything about anything, you have to understand what's the problem you are trying to deal with. If you do not diagnose the problems reasonably well, you are bound to blunder. So the first issue I want to deal with, how did we think the Egyptian problems, the economic problems, were in July of 2013? So the diagnosis of the problem. Second, I want to cover the issue of what options did we have? What alternatives did we have? And third, I want to say, and what did we, what we decided to do in response to which option did we follow? And finally, I want to say something about why should you be interested? Is what I'm going to say relevant for anybody else? Or is it just an Egypt-eccentric story that has nothing to do with anybody else, and it's just Egypt talking to Egyptians, end of the story? That's the last comment, that's the last point I want to make. How did we see the problem? All too often, whenever international institutions, missions come to Cairo, each of them would be looking, Shakespeare was right, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. It depends on who is coming. If it's a group of people who care about macroeconomic stability, it is macroeconomic stability. If it's the people who care about poverty, it's poverty. If it's the people who care about the private sector, it's the private sector. That's essentially it. Everybody is looking at the diagnosis of the problem from one particular angle, depending on where they come from. The way we saw the problem is that we had 3 problems at the same time. That is the interim government that I was part of in July of 2013. One, we had macroeconomic instability or imbalances. 2, we had a sluggish economic growth with high unemployment. 3, we had very high poverty and outrageous inequality, at least the way people see it, even if it's not for real. And any government that wants to deal with the problems of the country at that time could not afford to be dealing with one issue or one problem, one side of the problem, leaving the other 2. So essentially, whatever formula you come up with had to be integrated, had to be a formula that worries about both macroeconomic stability, activating the economy, and worrying about issues of poverty and social demands. The situation was tough, I have to tell you, because this is a time when the economy is doing badly, but but the aspirations on the street were incredibly high. The distance between what people want and want it today and what you can afford with the economy not doing well and resources are scarce were just too big. It's almost like an impossible mission or a mission impossible. You really can't satisfy what people want in time. And knowing that you are an interim government, you have to do something about it now. But you are honest enough to want to think about what you can do now so that you can prepare the grounds for the future as well. So it was that dual task that we were worried about. How do we deal with the situation as I described, and simultaneously, how do you pave the way for subsequent governance? Foundational measures, if you like. So this is how we saw the problem. What options did we have? We had essentially two options. One of them is to say, well, look, the situation is so bad, you have to do macro stability first. You have to follow even austerity measures. You have to bite the bullets. You have to really do what you have to do now, because if you don't do it, everything is going to go down the drain. And hopefully, if you do that first, you are setting the stage for structural reform, for issues on social justice, for dealing with education and pension and everything else. That was one option. And that is essentially the option that was on the table between January 2011 until June 2013. We thought that was a disastrous option. Why? Because if the economy was growing at only about 2%, unemployment is growing, it was at around 13%, if the economy is operating essentially at half capacity, or too many resources are sitting idle and people are not operating at full capacity, and then you go and push them further, it was totally the wrong thing to do. It was pushing the economy in the wrong direction. It was accentuating the problems. So you might be bringing some macroeconomic stability by doing austerity measures, but simultaneously you will be sacrificing growth, increasing unemployment, and probably getting people to go on the street in larger numbers, and this government would last only for 2 weeks. That's basically it. The guys on the outside, they don't understand the idea of you want to do something because there are people out there you want to deal with. So that's basic. So we had the option of following an austerity program and really restoring macro balances first, and the rest would follow. Or alternatively, following the old-fashioned Keynesian economics, which is activating the economy while being intelligent enough not to exacerbate the problems of macro imbalances, and then doing some stuff on the social agenda. This was the formula that we went for. So the two choices were very different, and successive governments for 2.5 years were actually pursuing one strategy, and we decided to follow a completely different strategy. The big trick was, in order to do that, you need injections of funds from somewhere. Where would you get the money from? That was really the trick. We were lucky enough to have a deposit in the central bank sitting there for 15, 20 years of $9 billion. The dollars were spent, but the Egyptian pounds were just being there in a deposit, and we used that to put together a stimulus package. So we're not printing money, and we're not, anyway. So that was one, and then the Gulf came afterwards, and we had another stimulus package. So we had two stimulus packages. Both of them add up to something like 3% of GDP, and this is really significant. And at the end of the day, what we promised them as a government is that growth rate will be slightly higher by the end of the fiscal year, and budget deficit will also be lower because we used much of the money that we got partly to reduce the public debt or overdraft the central bank, but simultaneously to invest in infrastructure, because we believe that investment in infrastructure will activate the economy in the short run, but in the medium run, a few years later, it will crowd in the private sector. So it was a win-win situation. You're achieving the short-term objective while you're being consistent with a longer-term perspective as well. And simultaneously, we initiated quite a few reforms to bring about fiscal balances, some stuff on the revenue side, value-added tax, real estate tax, at least prepare the ground for both. We also did a full plan for the phasing out the energy subsidy, which was eating a quarter of the budget. And we did some expenditure on social areas. I mean, a meal for students in school and the like. I don't want to be listing whatever we have done. It's a long list, but the idea is that we were trying to balance all three objectives in one. At the end of the day, I think in June 2013, the picture looks a bit more positive than it was before. Budget deficit is down from 14% of GDP to 10% of GDP. Economic growth in the first quarter of the year was only 2% and 1.2 or 1.5, and the last quarter is 3.5. So the formula did work. I think we were fortunate enough to get enough support that enables us to do that kind of impossible trinity, if you like, trying to combine different things that look conflicting at the beginning, but eventually they hang together well. Let me move on to the last bit of what I have to say, which is why would anyone care about the story in Egypt in particular? And I would argue generally that the spirit of that story is very useful for other countries. All too open. I mean, in the US, when they had the financial crisis in 2008, what did they do? Did they do the austerity program or did they do the stimulus program? If the US is doing that, why would other countries be denied to do that? I just don't see it. Every time a country is facing a problem, you do have a choice. And it doesn't have to be Egypt, it can be any other country. You have two choices, really two broad choices. And deliberately you would go for one rather than another. And I would be arguing any time for the other, not the austerity one. Did I run out of time, Mr. Chairman, or not yet? How much time do I have?
2 more minutes.
Good. That's plenty. And since you abused your position as chair and took more time, I'm going to abuse it to take more time. No, I'm kidding. I'm not going to do that. The other issue that I want to highlight also that's relevant for other countries is this idea that if you were to go for stimulus packages, the character of what you do is important. It's not good enough that you say, no, I'm going to follow Keynes and do stimulus. You need to worry about the composition of that. Two-thirds of the two stimulus packages went into public investment in infrastructure. We could have been the most popular government on earth by spending it on making people happy. But guess what? We would have been making everybody cry afterwards. And that was not very wise and not very responsible either. So it is important that you worry about the composition of your stimulus package. That's something that I also in the context of all this, I just want to highlight one last element on what I think is relevant for other countries possibly is the nature of the relationship between Ministry of Finance and central banks. During that period, there was a very reasonable level of coordination. Generally, when the central bank and Ministry of Finance don't get along, that's not too bad after all, because in fact, if they get along, we might all drown. They conform too much and everybody is pursuing being accommodated or dominated by the other. I think that's not necessarily good news for anyone, for the country in particular. But there are instances where coordination on certain issues was useful. And during that transition period, the central bank in Egypt did cut interest rate 3 times, 1.5 percentage points altogether, and that was consistent with the whole idea of stimulating the economy and not worrying about the inflation as much as you would under normal circumstances when the economy is heating and you are fully utilizing your capacity. So this is one of these cases where coordination between fiscal and monetary policy were, I think, all for the good. Let me conclude by saying something that's very different from what I have just been talking about. I'm an economist by training, and I'm not a politician, and I never joined the party, and I have no plans of being one. So that's just to be. However, I happen to believe that politics is something that you cannot ignore or leave aside or pretend that it doesn't exist as an economist. In sitting here and making policy recommendations, one thing after another, and telling people about what ought to be done, nothing ever happens in a vacuum. Everything happens in a context. and in the context at a certain point in time. And any recommendation anyone makes, abstracting from politics, one is missing the point. Let me even go beyond that and argue, as our friends in Harvard and MIT, Asimoglu and Robinson, would argue that countries, the difference between countries that fail and countries that succeed is the nature of political institutions they have. They never tell you whether it is the health of the financial sector or competition in the financial sector that makes it. It is the difference between South Korea and North Korea is the political institutions they have. And the outcome you get at the end of the day is whether you have inclusive political institutions or not. Because people would have a voice, and they would force politicians into taking the policy decisions that are in the interest of most people. And that's why I'm very, whenever we had a trade-off between, let's say, having a good constitution and a voting on the constitution or phasing out energy subsidy, and the two conflict, I would go for the constitution and voting on the constitution ahead of energy subsidy reform. So politics matter, and I think this is probably what makes me optimistic about what's going on in both Tunisia and Egypt. Thank you.